everybody! I've been at the woodpile again. We were splitting some of the larger chunks that came with our firewood delivery, and unfortunately, we did not realize that this piece of oak had quite a bit of curl in it until we split it open. So it was a pretty good sized piece before. Unfortunately, I have a couple of smaller pieces now. Not really sure what I'm going to do with it, but I'm going to make something out of it. The curly bits seem to be mostly on one side, so I cut a chunk off and I'm going to mount this one in a bowl orientation or a side grain orientation. I'm also going to use the rest of this piece and put it in a spindle orientation and see what the grain looks like both directions. A little bit later, I'm going to explain the difference between a bowl orientation and a spindle orientation as far as side grain and end grain. Also, because I want to talk a little bit about spindle roughing gouges versus spindle gouges and or bowl gouges. I mounted this blank with the bark side facing the headstock, and that's going to result in a natural edge style bowl. I did that only because the way that this piece is cut from the wood splitter, it's larger at the top where the bark is rather than at the bottom. Also, I think that doing it this way is going to keep that curl in the bottom of the bowl rather than cutting it away. Right now, I'm still just on a little bit of a fact-finding mission in trying to get the entire blank into round, and then I'll decide what exactly I think I want to make out of it. I want to take just a second and talk about safety. Anybody that does any sort of work around machinery is definitely aware of the potential safety risks. I wear a glove when I'm turning. It's a batting glove, so it fits very tightly. I wear a long sleeve jacket, and I tuck the sleeve into the batting glove so that there isn't anything loose hanging around. Neither of these things are recommended practice around a lathe. Anything could get caught in any part of the bits that are spinning and make for a very bad day. So if you work around machinery, be sure that you are responsible for your own safety. Make sure you're aware of the potential risks in doing things like wearing gloves or long sleeve shirts or whatever. So make sure that you're comfortable in however you're working around machinery. I've still got a flat spot up at the top there, so I'm going to just finish cleaning the tenon up and turn it around in the chuck, and then I will go over the outside shape a little bit more as I decide what it is that I'm going to do with this. Several of you guys gave me some suggestions about how to get the blank off of the woodworm screw when it gets stuck. And I believe that it was Lori who suggested the strap wrench, and I just happened to have one big enough to go around this blank, and that worked out really well, so thanks, Lori. There's a little bit of a joke about wood turners, and they start out with this giant hunk of wood, and then they end up with a toothpick. This is going to be a little bit like that. I still have a flat spot up at the top, and I don't want to make this one into a calabash style bowl, which would curve it around and I could keep a lot of the diameter. So I'm just going to keep going until I get both of these wings into round, and then I'm going to work on the outside shape a little bit. I could definitely have left this a much larger bowl, but I decided I wanted to make it a little bit different. Okay, we're round at the top, and so now I'm going to start shaping it. Looks a little bit like a flower pot at this point, but... I started out shear scraping with my negative rake scraper, but I ended up going to just regular scraping so that I could refine that interior curve just a little bit. I shear scrape with my bowl gouges and my scrapers, so sometimes it just depends on what tool I happen to have in my hand at the time. It's still a little bit thick on the one side, so because this piece is green, I mean, it's not like soaking wet, but it's not dry. I need to turn it relatively thin and even, which is a little bit tricky since I made that little flare out at the bottom of the base, but, you know, we'll make it work. In addition to that curly grain, we've got a nice little bit of spalting on this piece. Okay, I like it. I was able to cut out all but one of the cracks, so I filled that with some black Starbond CA glue and just sanded it off. Nobody wants to watch sanding, so I'm going to show you some pictures of my beautiful little beagle butt. We got him 4 years ago on November 28th, and here he is on that day. He was 4.5 months old. Unlike most beagles, he loves the water and chases a tennis ball off the pontoon boat. He's only just a little bit spoiled. He has a cat that loves him very much. The dog doesn't love the cat nearly as much as the cat loves the dog, but he's pretty tolerant. Like every good parent, I also have to show you a few embarrassing pictures. He says, "Oh, Mom." And here he is with his piggy, which is kind of his binky. We had recently watched It's a Wonderful Life, and so we named him George Bailey after the character, though we call him Bailey. And he's a pretty good boy. Back to the task at hand. Okay, so after sanding, I wiped it all off with denatured alcohol, and I waited a good long time for it to completely dry because then I torched the rim. At this point, I think this is just going to be a decorative little bowl thing. I'm going to go ahead and do my normal finishing process on it. I'm going to hit it with denatured alcohol again, and then a 1 pound cut of shellac as a little bit of a sealer. Once that dried, I cut it back with a Scotch-Brite pad, and then I'm going to do the Axe abrasive sanding paste. Next, I'm going to use Brad's abrasive sanding paste, and then I'm going to use Brad's tongue wax as the top coat on this. I turned and finished this piece in the beginning of November, and toward the end of November, one of my favorite people in the world, she's from Scotland, came over, and I mentioned to her that I was thinking about making this into a mortise and pestle. And it turns out that she collects them, whether they are useful or decorative, so this is going to end up being a gift for her. So my plan is to take the rest of this log that's going to be in a spindle orientation and make a pestle to go with what is going to now be a mortar. I let the tongue wax soak in for a couple of hours and then I came back and buffed it. You'll see I've got a little green dish scrubby thing. I use it to hold a paper towel when I have an irregular edge or something that I don't want to get my fingers too close to. I'm going to use a jam chuck to take the tenon off, and this is actually what started out as the first pestle. It ended up being a bit too wee, so I ended up making a second one out of the other half of the cylinder. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about safety again, but this has to do with tools. There are things called spindle roughing gouges and spindle gouges and bowl gouges, and they are different. And you should not use a spindle roughing gouge on a bowl blank. And that's because the way that it is constructed is not nearly as strong as a bowl gouge or a spindle gouge. Spindle gouges and bowl gouges are made from a rod of steel, and then the flute is ground out of it. The spindle roughing gouges, generally speaking, are made from a flat piece of steel that is rolled up and then has a tang. And that tang is not nearly as strong, obviously, as a solid rod of steel. The blank that's on the lathe right now is in spindle orientation. If you took a tree, let it lay on the ground, and then mounted it on the lathe, it would look just like this. The grain is running parallel to the bedways. Whereas when you have a bowl blank, you have it coming at you. You've got end grain and then side grain and then end grain and then side grain. Whereas a spindle blank, you only have side grain coming at you. So spindle roughing gouges should only be used on spindle blanks. I've got the tenon on there and I'm going to turn it around in the chuck and then finish getting this into a cylinder. And I'm using a spindle roughing gouge because this is a spindle blank. I split this in half, and I initially had turned the left half for the pestle, but it was not big enough, so we're going to use this half in the rest of the video to make the pestle from. I don't do a lot of spindle turning, and so I'm not hugely confident with the spindle gouges. That's something that I definitely need some practice on. I do know that you're always cut downhill in spindle blanks. Like a lot of wood turners, I'm moderately terrified of the skew, but I decided that I needed to get rid of a lot of material, and this definitely is the fastest way to do that. I did the same process here, sanded from 80 to 400 grit, and then I will do my normal finishing process, which is the denatured alcohol, and then shellac, and then Axe abrasive sanding paste, and then Brad's abrasive sanding paste, and then Brad's tongue wax as the final finish. The first pestle that I made, the one that was just a bit too wee, I parted off perfectly. This one, of course, I threw on the floor, but whatever. I don't have a drill chuck that has a Morse taper with a threaded end, so I use a collet chuck and a drawbar to hold the sanding pad so that I can finish off the bottom of the pestle. And I did the same thing. I went from 80 to 400 on the bottom, and then I finished it off. This one's better, but it probably should have been a little bit longer still. Fortunately, it's just going to be a decorative piece and not be used, so it's not critical. Not too bad for a piece literally saved from the firewood pile. I actually really like the way that this came out. I like that shape. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button for me. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Until next time, y'all be safe out there. George Bailey? What's he want?